Hello and welcome to Relatable Code. In this video, we're going to talk about fragments in Android. So let's get started. Imagine you're visiting a museum with several rooms, each showcasing different exhibits. In Android, fragments are like these individual rooms. Just as each room has its own unique display and purpose, each fragment in your app represents a portion of the user interface or behavior, separate from the other. So you can visit one room or fragment at a time, but they all exist within the same museum, in our case, the activity. Fragments are very versatile and reusable. They allow you to create dynamic and flexible user interfaces. They can exist independently, or they can work together to form a complete UI experience, and they are very fundamental in Android development. So you can think of activities as containers for these fragments, and creating a fragment is very straightforward. I'm going to show you how by going to the application folder right here at the left, right-click on that folder, go to New, Fragment, Fragment Blank for our case. Let's create a blank fragment, and it will be our first fragment. You can name it whatever you want, and click on Finish in the bottom right. And that's how you create a fragment in Android. It's that simple. But creating a fragment in this way generates a lot of code that we don't need. So we're going to remove a lot of this code, most of it actually. Okay, it finished compiling, so now we can begin by removing what we don't need, which is this, this, and this, basically. We don't need those as well. For now, that's all we need for our fragments. Just as an activity, a fragment gets generated with an XML layout file. Just like that. By default, it gets generated with a frame layout, which we don't like, so we use constraint layout, like that. And here, let's just have a gravity at center. And let's just change the text of that text view to first fragment, just for now, so that we can learn how to use that first fragment inside our main activity. So go back to your main activity. Let's close that and that as well. Here inside your main activity, in order to view this first fragment, you have to add something in your XML called a fragment container view. And here inside your activity underscore main.xml, we're going to create that fragment container view. And you can do that by opening a tag in the XML view and choosing fragment container view. Give it a match parent and match parent for its size. And I think here it will take a name for the fragment, which will be first fragment in our case. So just choose first fragment, give it an ID so that we can use it later, and call it fragment container view. That's all you need essentially. And let's just run our application. So go ahead and run your app. And here you can see that this first fragment was loaded into our main activity. And that was very straightforward. Fragments resemble activities in a lot of ways, but they are a lot more lightweight than activities. And they are interchangeable, as we've discussed, and they can act pretty much independently from each other. Okay, so we're going to create another fragment so that I can show you how to navigate between these fragments and the same activity, which is their container. Okay, so go back to your package right here and create another fragment. And let's name it, you guessed it, second fragment. wait for it to compile. It's compiled. Delete what we don't need, pretty much everything. I just like to create them this way because they automatically get a layout file. So this is our second fragment, and that's its layout file. Let's do the same for this frame layout. Let's delete it, and let's write a second fragment. Let's give it a centered gravity as well. And let's go back to our first fragment. Move that to the left. You can keep tabs by having the Kotlin code and next to it the XML code, which makes it pretty much easier to follow when you have lots of tabs opened. So go back to your fragment first XML, and here we're going to need a button so that we can click on that button and navigate to our second fragment. So let's do this inside our design tab, which is easier actually. Give that text view some wrap content. You can center it like that in your activity. That worked because I had this option enabled like that, and now I can drag and drop a button right there and give it a top margin, which it didn't respect. Let's delete that. Okay, now it respected that margin. Let's give it a top margin of 20 dp. I think that's fine. Let's change the ID to btn underscore navigate. Refactor that. Change its text to navigate. So now we have this button which we can use to navigate to our second fragment. So inside our first fragment, we can actually use view binding here as well. Let's create that. Private late init var. Our XML file is called fragment first. So this will be generated as fragment first binding. Okay. And here you have to inflate that binding. So what you're going to do is binding equals to fragment first binding dot inflate layout inflator, and underneath that you can return binding dot root. This will no longer be a nullable view because it will definitely have a value. And that's the onCreateView method of the fragment, which is where in most cases the XML file is handled, where you can inflate that XML file. And contrary to the main activity, where you have an onCreate method where this XML file is handled, and underneath that method or inside this method, you can also manipulate your views. With respect to fragments, it's a little different because you don't do that inside the onCreate. Fragments do have an onCreate method like this one, but at this stage you don't have an XML file that you can work with yet. Okay, that XML file gets rendered inside the onCreate view, which happens after the fragments onCreate. And when you want to work with the views of your XML, you actually don't work with them inside the onCreate view. You work with them inside the onViewCreated, which gets rendered after your views get created, basically. And this happens after onCreateView, which also happens after onCreate. We won't use onCreate very often. And here you can see that fragments have a different life cycle from activities. Okay, but they do share some similarities. What you need to know for now is that you will handle the binding or inflating your XML file inside on create view, and you will handle the logic of that fragment inside on view created. Okay, so inside on view created, we want to handle clicking on this button to navigate to second fragment. Okay, and there's an approach that I like to use, which will help us in this case to really decouple our code, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that shortly. So first fragment has to navigate to second fragment, but we want to keep our fragments very much independent from each other, so that navigation can happen inside our main activity, since our activity will be the container of these fragments, and it actually has an XML component called a fragment container view. So inside your main activity, if you want to follow this approach, you can create an interface right here. This is optional actually. You can create an interface called fragment action, for example. And inside fragment action, we want to handle the actions that may happen inside our fragments. One of those actions is clicking on this button. So let's add a function inside our interface, and let's call it fun on first fragment button clicked. And to use this interface, you can have your main activity implemented with comma after the app compat activity and fragment action, which will force us to implement this interface right there. And here you can handle navigating to the second fragment. Okay, and I like this approach because when you want to add some methods to those fragments to have some actions, you will add those methods to your interface, which will force you to implement them inside your main activity. So you will make sure that you won't forget any action that you need for your application. Okay, because these methods are obligatory to implement. So inside on first fragment button clicked, what we want to do is to make our fragment container view switch or replace its current fragment with a new fragment. And it's also straightforward to do inside your on first fragment button clicked method. You can handle that with a support fragment manager, which is the fragment manager of your activity, which handles basically the actions related to your fragments. Okay, and those can be done with something called a transaction. After you click on the dot, you will have a method called begin transaction. Okay, because this is an operation that will replace a fragment with another fragment. This is called a transaction. Okay, and we can actually write some nice code here with the dot also. Okay, and here we can have fragment transaction like that, and inside this fragment transaction we can instruct it to replace our current fragment with the second fragment, and we can do that with fragment transaction dot, you will see you have a method called replace. Okay, that replace method will handle receiving an ID and a fragment to navigate to. This ID will be the ID of your fragment container view, and this is essential. You can handle that with binding dot fragment container view dot ID like that, and here you have to create your second fragment, which doesn't require any parameters for now, so you can do that with second fragment as an empty constructor. Okay, and after that after calling the .replace method, so that this method can actually take place, you have to call another method, which is commit, which will commit your transaction and have it take place, actually. Okay? And that's just it for how you can replace your current fragment with a new fragment. These concepts might be new to you, but I think they can be manageable. Okay? Because to work with fragments inside an activity, you can say that we need something called a fragment manager. And to gain access to that fragment manager, you can write support fragment manager, okay, which is available because we are inside an app compat activity. Okay, if you control left click on that, you can see that this is a method that we can access inside our activity. And to have this operation take place where we want to navigate from one fragment to another, we need something called a transaction to take place. And to work with that transaction, we just need two methods. One method to have that transaction replace our current fragment with a target fragment, and another method to commit this transaction so that it can take place. Okay, and we're going to test this out after we call this method from our first fragment. But how can we do that? This method is declared inside our main activity, and we need it inside our first fragment. But in our case, the main activity is the container of that fragment, and there's something that you can do here, which is require activity as main activity. Okay, so you're going to get the activity of this fragment, and you're going to cast it to main activity. And you can access a method from main activity by wrapping those inside some parentheses, and then calling the dot, which will give us access to this method, basically. Okay, it's really that easy to do because the activity of this fragment is the main activity. But in complex applications, you might find that you have some fragments which are called from different activities, especially with old applications. Because before fragments were created, we only had activities to work with. After creating fragments, we tried to migrate from activities to fragments, and we were able to migrate a lot of our code base to using fragments, but in some cases, we still needed some activities. So we weren't able to have just a single activity and multiple fragments, which is the current and modern approach, if you want, with respect to views. So in many cases, we had different activities that reused many of these fragments. Okay, and to handle that, we can check for the activity of our fragment here if it is main activity, so that we can safely access its method. We can do that with require activity is main activity. That's just a check that helps us make sure that the parent activity of this fragment is in fact main activity. Okay, and as I've said, you will need this in all the applications that you will work with, just to make sure that you can safely access this code. Because if you try to trigger this code without this check, if for some reason this fragment wasn't contained inside main activity, you will get a crash. Your application will crash and you will have a lot of unhappy users. Okay, so that's how you can safely access this method from your main activity, which will trigger a transaction to replace the current fragment with this fragment. Okay, and commit that transaction so that it can take place. So let's run our application and check how this will happen. You will run your application, you will check your emulator, and we have second fragment. And this happened because, as usual, we forgot to add an on-click listener to our first fragment for the button in particular. So here, binding.btn navigate.set onClickListener. Get that code inside your onClickListener, because if you don't, as you've seen, the second fragment will just get loaded immediately as soon as the first fragment is set up inside your main activity. Don't worry about that for now. Just do this and rerun your application. And now you can see that this is our first fragment. And after clicking on Navigate, our second fragment will appear, because after clicking on Navigate, we checked if our parent activity was main activity. And I'm saying parent activity because, as I've said, activities are containers for fragments. So each fragment will definitely have an activity that it's paired to, if you want, or a parent activity, as I like to call it. So here we're checking if our parent activity is main activity, so that we can access this method, which replaced our current fragment with second fragment that had this layout, which we can see inside our emulator. Okay. As you may have noticed, we completely decoupled our first fragment from our second fragment. And what I mean by that is, after clicking on the button inside the first fragment, we didn't try to navigate to the second fragment from here inside the first fragment. We just had a method inside our main activity, which we called, and inside that method, this navigation was triggered. Okay, so this function can be triggered from pretty much any fragment that you want, and it will properly navigate you to the second fragment. Okay, so you can easily replace this method with another method, for example, which takes you to another fragment, or maybe a method that can do something else, maybe to display a toast, maybe to trigger a network call, for example. Okay, and that's why I like to use this approach. But you need to note something here. Go back to your emulator. If you notice, we are inside our second fragment right now. But if I click on the back button, I don't go back to my first fragment. I exit the whole application instead. Okay, and this is where you have to note about something called backstack with fragments, which we're going to cover right now. Now, think of your museum visit. As you move from one room to another, you remember the path that you took, so that you can retrace your steps back. This is what backstacks do in Android. Every time you replace one fragment with another, it's like moving to a new room. The backstack keeps track of the fragments that you've visited, so that when you press the back button, it's like you're walking back to the previous room. The backstack ensures that you don't get lost in your application, which helps you maintain a history of your fragment transactions, so that users can navigate backward through them intuitively. Okay? You can easily handle this backstack right here with your fragment transaction by writing fragment transaction dot add to backstack, and here you can optionally supply a name, but that won't be necessary in our case because we only have two fragments basically. I'm going to show you why you might need a name in a little bit, but for now just run your application again. Check out your first fragment, click on Navigate, and from second fragment, click on the back button, which will now take you back to your first fragment. Okay, and that's what the backstack did in our case, because as we've discussed with our museums, we just went back to our previous room, in our case, the previous fragment. Okay, and here with respect to the name, and more complex applications where you might have 50 or more fragments, for example, if you have fragments A, B, and C in that order, you can optionally supply a name to that backstack if, in case, you want to navigate back from fragment C directly to fragment A for some reason. which will be valid in a lot of use cases. Okay, you might need that in a case like this, but for our application, for now, we just have these two fragments. Okay, and that's how you can handle the backstack for these two fragments. Now, that's excellent. But how can we send some data from our first fragment to our second fragment, like how we did with our intents between activities? Well, with fragments, you can actually send some arguments between fragments, and let's see how we can do that. So inside our dot replace method, right here, we can see that we're directly referencing second fragment, like that. Well, we can modify that second fragment to also include some arguments, and we can do that with dot apply. And here, to be able to pass some arguments into this fragment, we need something called a bundle. And you can do that with arguments equals to bundle dot apply as well. And inside this bundle, you can pass whatever you want from the first fragment to the second fragment. So let's say I want to pass a string, for example. I can write put string right there. And we need a key and a value as well, so that we can intercept this value from our second fragment and display that string as we want. Okay, let's see how we can do that. Let's just pass a key as key and a value as, for example, value from first fragment. Okay, what we did here was we accessed the arguments of this second fragment through arguments itself. After using .apply, we were able to get a scope of this second fragment, and we were able to modify these arguments by supplying a bundle. Okay, this bundle will be the form of communication between fragments for our case. To modify that bundle, we also used bundle.apply so that we can put basically any value that you want in that bundle. We can put a string and we can put a serializable as well, so that we can pass them between fragments, and we can use parse syllables as well. Okay, just like we did with intents and activities. So here we modified the arguments of our second fragment. So now inside our second fragment, we can now access this value, okay, from this key. So the way that we can do that is inside your onView created. Let's see here inside our binding, you can modify the ID of that text view to become TV second fragment, so that we can access it with binding.tv second fragment.text equals to, and we can directly have a reference to the arguments of this second fragment with arguments. Okay, these might be null, so here you can add a null check with a question mark and get string through a key, the key which is this key. Okay, so copy that and just get the value from this key. Let's see how that works by running our application again. That's our application. We start with our first fragment. After clicking on navigate, you can see that we have this value from our first fragment, which we were able to pass to second fragment, or any fragment that you want in that case. Okay, we did that by modifying the arguments of this second fragment to include a bundle which had a string that we wanted to pass from our first fragment to our second fragment. We intercepted that string inside our second fragment through arguments.getString and with this key, which we supplied inside the bundle, okay, so that we can safely access this value. I hope that was clear, and That's basically it for passing data between fragments. Now, I think that's enough content for one video. So if you find my content to be relatable, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for future content, and I'll see you in the next video.